The Pentagon sending nearly 4,000 more U.S. troops to the southern border to try to ramp up security, as thousands of Central American migrants are less than 300 miles from the Texas border. Griff Jenkins is traveling with that group. He joins us live from Saltillo, Mexico. So, Griff, what are you seeing on the ground? Who is helping these migrants get to the border?
You know, John, it's the Mexican state governments. In this case, Huila is helping them. Behind me is literally the gate where the nearly 2,000, maybe more than 2,000 migrants that began their journey on January 15th in San Pedro Sula, Honduras, are making the final last leg. These officials, these police officers and community workers, putting them on dozens of buses. We were told there were 50 buses driving them that final 300 miles to Piedras Negras, which is the city immediately across the U.S. border from Eagle Pass, Texas. Border Patrol obviously is aware of it. They say they're making preparations, but many of these migrants have told us their intention is to cross illegally. One of them that told us about his plight was Antonio. Here's what he had to say.
Once I get in the States, my idea is, my place, work hard for 5 years in there and make my family feel better. Actually, looking for better things for my family.
Now, when they get to Piedras Negras, it's anybody's guess what will happen, but they're on their way. They should be there by the end of today. John?
So what happens next? What happens when they get to the border?
Well, in Piedras Negras, they've got facilities set up, and they will get federal government support. You know, this new Mexican president, López Obrador, has been very pro-immigrant. He had the fast-track work visa. They capped it. It became too full at 12,600. But these migrants will get federal resources on the border town of Piedras Negras. The Mexican officials here, the secretary to the state of Huila, says his hope is that the U.S. will process asylum claims much faster. John?
Griff Jenkins traveling with that migrant caravan in Mexico. Thank you.
The clock is ticking. With just 2 weeks to go until the government shuts down again, lawmakers are clashing over border funding. It comes as more troops and yet another caravan both make their way toward the southern border. President Trump considering whether to declare a national emergency tomorrow night or ahead of the State of the Union address. Yesterday on Sunday Morning Futures, I spoke with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle and asked whether House Speaker Nancy Pelosi will put forth money for that wall. She has said umpteen times there will be no money for any wall anywhere. There will be nothing. There will be $1, not more than that, because a wall is immoral. But in fact, isn't there a growing group of colleagues on the left, your colleagues, that say exactly what you just said, which is practical, that there should be money for everything, including in areas where it makes sense, a physical barrier?
I know in the past she has said where it makes sense to have physical barriers, we support physical barriers.
It's not a question about spending the dollars. It's a question, I suppose, either politics, which I think dominates when you have the speaker saying that no money, not $1 for wall, and you have the president insisting on a wall, in part because that's what he campaigned on and was elected on. It becomes politics, but it's not a financial, it's not a budgetary issue.
Joining me right now is Texas Congressman, House Energy and Commerce Committee member, and medical doctor Michael Burgess. Congressman, it's good to see you this morning. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks
so
for
what do
having
you
me on.
think? Does this get resolved? Most people see right through this, that this is politics, that there are areas where we need a physical barrier, and then there are other areas where we don't.
Well, it certainly gets very interesting tomorrow night when all the principals are gathered in one place. But look, the president has said he needs money for physical barriers. I think there is, at least I've heard the past several days, some agreement from Democratic colleagues that physical barriers are important, are part of the solution.
Yeah.
I'm a little disappointed this conference committee wasn't in Washington over the weekend, is my understanding. They really need to be getting the information from the experts, present it. We're all going to have to vote on whatever it is they come up with in a few weeks' time.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see maximal effort on this.
Well, let me ask you this, because the president has been saying over the last couple of days that the wall is already being built, and that he's expecting 115 miles of wall to be built in the short term. So where is that money coming from? One of my guests yesterday said that there's about a half $500 million In the Homeland Security committee, the Office of the Homeland Security, that is from confiscated drug money. Is that use? If it hasn't been allocated, the president can use that money, right?
Well,
if it hasn't been appropriated.
There are dollars in the account from previous appropriations. Not as sure about your other story about the confiscated drug money, but yeah, there's money in the account, so there is work ongoing at the present time.
So he can,
and the president is quite correct about
begin that building. He can begin it.
Yeah, well, of course, the building has been going on for years. In 2006, the Secure Fence Act said we were going to once and for all secure our southern border. Nancy Pelosi voted for it. Chuck Schumer voted for it. I think Barack Obama, when he was a senator, voted for it.
That's right.
So the authorization from Congress is there. The dollars need to be supplied. Congress makes the appropriations. That's what has to happen next.
But people recognize that they voted for it before, that there's a wall in California, Nancy Pelosi state dividing Tijuana from San Diego. And yet this politicking keeps going on. Even the guests will be divided at the State of the Union tomorrow night. The Journal this morning is reporting that Republicans are planning to invite law enforcement officials, while Democrats are inviting undocumented immigrants who work at golf clubs owned by President Trump.
Yeah, it can be an interesting juxtaposition. I'm actually going to bring a constituent who lost a daughter hit by a car driven by someone who was in the country, not here legally. He, of course, was a veteran and came to me one day and said, I put on the uniform and I was doing my job in Iraq. If you'd been doing your job, Congressman, my daughter would still be here. And that's been pretty tough to take. I have invited him to the State of the Union. I hope he'll be able to be there tomorrow night. It'll be something to see.
So you're a medical doctor. The president is also expected to talk about lowering costs for health care and prescription drugs. What are you expecting to hear out of the State of the Union tomorrow night?
Well, I do think the rebate issue that came up last week, and for companies to be able to directly reimburse patients rather than middlemen or third-party intermediaries or insurance companies to provide these rebates directly to patients, that seems to make a lot of sense. And I expect we may hear the president talk about that. And, of course, his trade policies have been front and center for some time. So I expect we'll hear him, and he ran on that. He won on that. I expect to hear him talk about his trade policies as well.
And what will you be listening for specifically within health care?
Within healthcare, a year ago, he laid it out and said pharmaceutical prices are too high and they're going to come down. Trust me, they're going to come down. I think he is going to continue to push that point. The work that the Secretary of Health and Human Services has done with the index pricing, with drugs sold on a global market, that's been interesting. Got a lot of people upset,
right.
But at the same time, it's been an interesting approach. I think you're likely to hear a continuation of that discussion that the president has put out before.
Do you think that this is going to be the next 2 years of just fighting between the Democrats and the president, that you guys get nothing done for 2 years? How's that going to play on people going into 2020 and another presidential election?
Well, it was fortunate that the first 2 years of the Trump administration were so productive, because I do think you're correct, and we have entered into the 2020 presidential race early. Iowa is still a year away, but every day that goes by, there's a new seemingly legitimate Democratic candidate. The press, as we all know, has been aligned against this president right from the get-go, and he will continue to have to carry all of that burden, and yet somehow this administration manages to get things done. So I will tell you, from the standpoint of being in the Congress, we got more done the first 2 years of the Trump administration than we had the previous 15 years. It really has been, when people stop and look at the accomplishments in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, they were significant. And goodness knows, you talked last hour about people who are talking down the economy.
Yeah.
That worries me too. I don't know why that is happening, except that one way they see to defeat the president is to tank the economy. But that's a terrible, terrible deal for the American people.
Well, it certainly looks good so far. The numbers have continued to show a strengthening economy in the U.S. Congressman, it's good to see you this morning. Thanks so much.
Good deal. Thank you.
Congressman Michael Burgess joining us there.
Let's bring in the Texas Attorney General now, Ken Paxton. He joins us live this evening from Texas, I believe. Thank you, sir, for joining us. How are you?
Hey, doing great. We are in Texas. Thanks for having me on.
So those 3,700 plus troops that are going to be headed down to the southern border, needed in your estimation, and they do what?
Oh, no doubt. I mean, I think they're going to help create more like wire fencing, and I think they're also going to be doing some border monitoring. So, yeah, absolutely. We have a huge problem along the border of people coming across, and we've had pretty much a porous border for decades, and absolutely we need all the help we can get down here to prevent the crimes that are associated with illegal immigration.
I guess one of the questions is when you send active U.S. troops down there, they have their duties are limited in scope. Do you think they actually stop people from immigrants from coming across the southern border into the United States?
Well, certainly our Border Patrol and Customs and Enforcement are the front line of defense for what you're talking about, but it certainly doesn't hurt, given that we likely don't have enough people along the border to prevent illegal immigration. It doesn't hurt to have backup people doing other things that then relieve the Border Patrol from having to do those particular duties. So, yeah, I think it definitely helps, and I'm glad the president is taking advantage of this opportunity.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the president because, you know, we got this big speech here in Washington tomorrow night, the State of the Union address. You want to hear what from President Trump?
You know, I want to continue to hear about what his ideas are for securing our border. That's something he ran on. It's something he's focused on more than any other president in my lifetime. And obviously he's got a challenge with Congress funding it. And so, you know, it's going to be interesting to see what he says his next steps are, given, you know, we had the shutdown and also his comments about, you know, declaring some type of emergency.
Yeah, should that next step be declaring a national emergency? Do you believe that the president should go down that route?
Look, all I can tell you is that we do have an emergency here. We are struggling with human trafficking. The two border states, California and Texas, have the highest incidence of human trafficking. I don't think that's a coincidence. We have, you know, drug issues that we deal with constantly, and our crime is affected. If you talk to some of these people that have lost loved ones, they would think that there is a national emergency because it's affected them directly.
I'll tell you what I think is going on, Mr. Attorney General, not only with the administration, the White House, the president, but also within the campaign as they look forward. They are, we've seen this from the president recently in the last few days, starting to talk more about human trafficking and trying to make this, in part, the border wall is needed, they say, to stop it when you're talking about women and young children. For example, we saw Brad Parscale, who is the campaign manager for the president's upcoming campaign. This is what he tweeted today. He said, quote, "The border wall fence has saved countless lives in El Paso and is worth it. If it saves one more young person from being human trafficking, I guess Speaker Pelosi doesn't care about saving even one victim." That last sentence, a lot going on there politically, but let's talk about the beginning. Is that where this is headed? Is that we're going to hear the White House and the campaign talk more about human trafficking and try to make this less about a physical wall?
Well, no, I think it's about both, but it clearly is an issue that, like in my state, we've been focusing on for several years in my AG's office. We started a human trafficking unit just because Texas is #2 in the nation for human trafficking. Houston's our worst city in America. It is a real issue affecting hundreds of thousands of victims.
How bad of a problem is it? Like, I know you say it's a real issue and it's an awful thing, but drill in on us if you can. How bad is it down there?
So, you know, we just started this a few years ago, and my office is fully busy with the few people that we have prosecuting these cases. We are engaged. We prosecuted probably 30 or so in the last couple of years. We took down a group called Backpage.com, which we think is the largest, or at least close to the largest, online purveyor of human trafficking. It was centered in Texas. So, yeah, it's definitely a problem. We see it, you know, every day in our state.
And we're probably going to hear the president talk about it tonight, or tomorrow night, rather, in the State of the Union address. Ken Paxton, the Attorney General in the state of Texas. Ken, thank you for joining us tonight.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Have a great